I never thought a simple fishing trip would expose the biggest betrayal of my life. But one unexpected confession led me down a path of secrets, lies, and a truth so devastating that it changed everything I thought I knew about my marriage. After years of marriage, maintaining a friendly and close relationship with your spouse can become a challenge, especially when so much of your time is devoted to family responsibilities. Despite this, I managed to strike a balance. But during a recent camping trip with friends, I stumbled upon a shocking truth about my wife, one that pushed me to start my own investigation. There are men out there completely oblivious to what's happening in their own marriages. I used to be one of them. Men like us should have a designated meeting place where we can sit together, share a few drinks, and confess our ignorance. The only catch: most of us wouldn't even realize that the meeting was meant for us. Mary and I tied the knot when we were just 20. We spent nearly every moment together, built a life, raised 3 children, and even found time for a little fun between pregnancies. I did my best to be the husband I had read about in marriage advice books, the kind who remains faithful, devoted, and present. When our youngest, Allison, left for college, I found myself wondering how Mary would fill her time now that the kids were grown. She decided to volunteer at the hospital, dedicating 3 days a week to helping others. She took shifts at the gift shop, assisted in the children's playroom, and contributed in various other ways. Even though our kids had moved out, our close-knit group of friends remained intact. We still gathered once a month for barbecues, house parties, and the occasional night out. Among this group, I became especially close to 3 men who shared my passion for fishing. At least 4 or 5 times a year, we would pack up and head out on weekend fishing trips, escaping the daily grind for a few peaceful days on the water. I had always assumed my marriage was just like everyone else's, following the same pattern as the couples around us. Our children had grown up and moved out, our wives had their own interests. Some worked, some didn't, and we, the husbands, were focused on our careers, slowly counting down the years until retirement. During these trips, we often found ourselves talking about life, sometimes drifting into deeper conversations about marriage, relationships, and even intimacy. Then came the fishing trip in May. The 4 of us sat in our boat, rods in hand, watching as our lines disappeared beneath the water. The conversation was light at first, as it usually was, until Jack brought up his recent visit to Stanford to see his son. Jack shared a story about his wife discovering an empty contraceptive wrapper in their son's room, which had deeply unsettled him. In response, Paul recounted his own experience after visiting their daughter at college. When he returned home, his wife mentioned that their daughter, Kelly, had confided in her about being in an intimate relationship with her boyfriend. We all chuckled as he described the young man, always in worn-out, dirty clothes, in desperate need of a shave and constantly slouching. Mike, however, remained silent. He seemed lost in thought, staring out at the water. Sensing his mood, I turned to him and asked, "Mike, what's on your mind? You look like something's bothering you." He hesitated before finally replying, "I'm not sure I should say anything. If I'm wrong, I might stir up something unnecessary and offend someone. But if I'm right, well, it could hurt all of us." I frowned, my grip tightening around my fishing rod. "Did you see something? Or is this just speculation?" Mike took a deep breath, keeping his eyes on the water. After a brief pause, he finally admitted, "I saw your wife parking behind the Marriott." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Whose wife?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Yours," he said, glancing at me. 3 weeks ago, and again the day before yesterday." Jack jumped in, his tone defensive. "Are you saying Mary is being unfaithful?" Mike shook his head. "I can't say that for sure. All I know is that I saw her there twice this past month." He then explained that his job required him to deliver groceries to the Marriott 3 times a week, just like any other hotel in town. Paul, who had been listening intently, slowly nodded, realizing the weight of the situation. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the question forming in my mind. Why would Mary be at the Marriott twice in 1 month? Was she really cheating on me? I stayed with the group, forcing myself to keep fishing. If I left too soon, it would be like admitting that I believed the worst, that my wife had betrayed me. When we finally returned to town, I dropped Jack off at his car and drove home. But when I arrived, the house was empty. Mary was gone. I sat down at my computer, staring at the screen, my mind racing. I needed to know the truth, and I had to figure out how to find it. I spent the next few hours scouring the internet for any clues that might help me uncover the truth. Eventually, I ordered a few discreet items that could aid in my investigation and had them shipped to my office to avoid suspicion. That evening, when Mary returned home, I tried to test the waters by flirting with her. But, as if on cue, she brushed me off, complaining of a headache. I wasn't surprised. In fact, I had expected it. For the next week, life carried on as usual. Mary and I followed our typical routine, but I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. My suspicions lingered, making every interaction feel like a test. I watched her closely, called her at random times throughout the day, hoping to catch something, anything, that seemed off. But everything appeared normal. Then, one evening, after receiving a package I had been waiting for, I retreated to the garage under the guise of tinkering with some tools. Hidden inside the box was a GPS tracker, which I carefully installed under Mary's car. If she was hiding something, this would help me find out. The next day, another package arrived, this one containing a small recording device. That night, while Mary was asleep, I discreetly placed it inside her car, making sure it was well hidden. Now, I could not only track where she was going but also listen to any conversation she had while driving. The following morning, over breakfast, Mary casually mentioned that she had no volunteer duties at the hospital and planned to spend the day shopping. From my office, I kept a close eye on the GPS tracker, watching her movements in real time. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She went to the mall, made a stop at the market, and by 1 p.m. she was back home. But then at 1:30 she left again. I watched as she drove south for 10 minutes, then turned east for another 10. Her destination? The Marriott. My stomach dropped. Without hesitation, I grabbed my keys and left my office, deciding to follow her. 5 minutes later, I arrived at the hotel and parked discreetly nearby, making sure I had a clear view of her car. For nearly 3 hours I waited. Then, at exactly 4:20, Mary emerged from the hotel. She walked directly to her car, her expression unreadable. As she got in, another familiar figure stepped out of the same hotel exit, Alex White. I stiffened in my seat. Alex was married to one of the most stunning women in our social circle. If he was involved in something secretive, it certainly wasn't because he was lacking affection at home. As Mary drove past him, they exchanged subtle nods, an acknowledgement that sent a ripple of unease through me. Alex lingered outside for a moment before heading toward his own car. Meanwhile, Mary remained in the parking lot, sitting in her car, seemingly waiting for something. Then her phone rang. I turned up the volume on the listening device. "Nick?" Her voice sounded puzzled. "Mary," a distant male voice replied. "Why not just say hello?" She hesitated before responding. "Hello. What would you like for dinner tonight?" he asked casually. Mary's tone softened. "How about trying something adventurous? Maybe a dish with hot sauce." "Oops," the voice on the other end chuckled. "We're out of sauce. Do you have any other ideas?" "Maybe something fresh and nutritious," Mary suggested. "Like a salad, or grilled salmon." I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing. This wasn't just a friendly conversation. This was coded. I tried my best to steer the conversation toward ordinary topics, keeping my voice steady and masking the turmoil brewing inside me. "What time will you be home?" I asked casually. "Around 5, Mary replied. "Sounds good. See you later." I ended the call and exhaled slowly, trying to process everything. But then an idea struck me, one that I couldn't ignore. Instead of leaving, I decided to park my car and walk into the Marriott. As I stepped inside, I immediately recognized a familiar face at the front desk, the daughter of one of my clients. Seizing the opportunity, I engaged in small talk for a few minutes, keeping the conversation light. Once I felt the moment was right, I leaned in slightly and asked, "Hey, I heard a friend of mine stays here often. Could you check for me?" She nodded without hesitation. "What's his name?" "Alex White," I said. Her fingers tapped quickly across the keyboard, and after a few moments she glanced back at me. "He checks in every Thursday morning without fail," she said. "Always stays the night and leaves the next morning. Same room every time. Occasionally he books a room on other days, but Thursdays? That's his routine." I swallowed hard. The computer records traced this habit all the way back to January. Keeping my composure, I asked, "Would it be a problem to print out those details?" She hesitated, lowering her voice. "As long as no one finds out?" "You have my word," I assured her. After a pause, she nodded. "Do you need a hard copy?" "Yes, please." A moment later, she handed me a Marriott folder containing the printout. I wasn't sure how or when I would use it, but holding it in my hands only confirmed what I had feared. Mary had been meeting Alex at this hotel for months. She had been lying to me. That evening, I sat across from Mary at the dinner table, watching her closely. She looked calm, unbothered, as if nothing had changed. After dinner, she curled up on the couch with a book while I retreated to my computer, my mind still racing. I scrolled through our social circle's contact list and eventually found what I was looking for: Alex's wife's email address. Using a separate, untraceable email account, I drafted a message. "If you want to know who is cheating on you, when and where, Alex, reply to this email. I have evidence you may be interested in." I stared at the message for a long moment, then hit send. Still fueled by adrenaline, I took another step. I installed a second GPS tracker, this time on Alex's car. If I was going to uncover the full truth, I needed to know more. After that, I left the house and went to a nearby sandwich shop for lunch, trying to clear my head. But no amount of food or fresh air could push away the realization that my marriage and everything I thought I knew about it was falling apart. I ordered a sandwich for myself and a salad for Alex's wife, Helen. At around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I parked near an open house sign and walked up to the front door. The moment Helen saw me, her face went pale. She stood up abruptly, quickly placed a sign outside saying she'd be back at 2 o'clock, and ushered me inside. We sat down on the sofa, and within seconds her eyes welled up with tears. She looked like she was barely holding herself together, on the verge of breaking down completely. I tried to give her a moment to collect herself, unsure of how to start the conversation. Then, remembering something that might serve as a distraction, I casually mentioned a professional conference I had recently come across. One designed specifically for people in my field, along with another event tailored for real estate agents. Helen perked up at the mention of the second conference. She immediately expressed interest, saying she had always wanted to attend an event like that. Once my reservation was confirmed, I brought up the conference with Mary, emphasizing the opportunities it offered for networking and professional growth. I even invited her to join me. She seemed intrigued but hesitated. "Let me think about it," she said. "I'll give you an answer in the morning." Meanwhile, Helen remained eager, waiting for final details on the trip. The next day, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was Helen, calling from a payphone. She told me she had booked a room at Treasure Island while I had reserved one at the Mirage. As we went over travel details, she asked what she should bring. I advised her to pack a laptop, a personal phone book, and a cell phone that wouldn't rack up outrageous fees in Vegas. Later that evening, as I was finishing up my packing, Mary walked into the bedroom and glanced at my suitcase. "You forgot your swimming trunks," she said. "I'm not planning on swimming," I replied. She gave me a small smile. "A quick swim can be refreshing, you know." Her comment lingered in my mind, but I let it slide. The next morning, Helen and I met for breakfast at a small cafe before heading to the airport. As we sat down, I couldn't help but notice how different she looked. Gone was the perfectly put-together real estate professional I was used to seeing. In her place was a woman who seemed raw, exhausted, and deeply shaken. The waitress brought the menus and poured our coffee, but Helen barely glanced at hers. She simply wrapped her hands around the cup and stared down, lost in thought. I had always known Helen to be polished and composed even at social events, but that morning in the cafe she seemed different, vulnerable, unsettled. After we finished eating, she let out a deep sigh. "I hate the thought of going to Vegas alone," she admitted. "Then come with me," I suggested without hesitation. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right." We left the cafe and drove to the nearest parking lot. Once there, I inquired about the rates for a 3-day stay. Finding them reasonable, I parked my car. As we sat there, I mused aloud, "I wonder if Alex's wife has already been contacted. If she hasn't, I suppose I should ask my wife to reach out to her," I added, thinking out loud. The parking attendant, overhearing our conversation, chimed in. "If you both hire me, I can actually save you a significant amount of money." "Thanks," I replied. Then, on impulse, I asked, "Can I pose a hypothetical question?" "Of course." "What would happen if Helen and I decided to be together while we're in Vegas?" The attendant smirked. "Unless your wife or Alex is tracking your movements, nothing will change. Just block both of their numbers." For a fleeting moment, the idea lingered in the air. But we both knew this wasn't about revenge. It was about understanding the mess we had been thrown into. "Do you want her to submit the documents first, or should she wait until you return?" the attendant asked. I shook my head. "No, I want to handle it myself." Helen and I exchanged a look, one filled with unspoken words. There was an undeniable pull between us, and for a brief second we almost gave in to it. But we restrained ourselves. Later that night, after settling into my room, the phone rang. It was Mary. "It's getting late. Where have you been?" she asked. "I had dinner at Caesar's and took a walk," I replied. There was a pause before she spoke again. "I saw a beautiful outfit today that I think you'd like. Should I buy it for you?" I sighed. You know I don't often dress up like that. I can't believe I'm almost 50, she muttered, as if speaking more to herself than to me. So, is that a no? I asked. It is, she confirmed. But if you come across a beautiful necklace or another piece of jewelry, I wouldn't mind that. Her voice was calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both pretending, going through the motions of a marriage that had already unraveled. I could have spent years drowning in self-pity, playing the role of the betrayed husband. I had already felt it creeping in, listening to melancholic songs on the radio, letting my mind spiral into sadness. But instead of wallowing in despair, I decided to take control of my life and reshape it the way I wanted. I longed for someone beside me in bed, not necessarily for intimacy but for comfort, for connection, for something real. She looked at me, her eyes filled with warmth and understanding. I long for your companionship and love, she admitted softly. But I'm not ready for anything more just yet. I placed my arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. That's okay, I reassured her. What matters is that we're here for each other. She gave me a small smile. I just like being with you. Later that evening, a call from my lawyer shattered any lingering doubts I had about Mary. The private investigator had uncovered the full truth. Alex and Mary had spent the night together in our home, in our bed. As if that wasn't enough, the investigator had captured photos of multiple rooms in the house. Our backyard, the living room, even my computer desk. My home, my sanctuary, had been completely violated. Grateful for the information, I thanked the lawyer and ended the call. My hands clenched into fists, my chest tightening with a storm of emotions. Helen must have sensed the shift in my mood because she reached for my hand. Let's get out of here, she said. We got into my car and drove toward the lake, hoping the open road would help clear our minds. But as we talked, the conversation became a roller coaster of emotions. Anger, sadness, betrayal. The pain didn't fade, not even as the miles stretched behind us. Yet, despite everything, something unexpected happened. For the first time in a long while, I felt something new. Being with Helen, simply sharing space with her, brought a sense of comfort I hadn't known I needed. The warmth of her presence eased the raw edges of my hurt, not erasing the pain but making it more bearable. The next morning, after another deep conversation, we found ourselves wrapped in an intimate moment. One that wasn't just about passion but connection. Afterward, we took a short nap, waking up to the soft glow of daylight streaming through the window. We ordered food and drinks, taking our time as we prepared to leave. There was no rush. Between stolen glances and lingering kisses, the unspoken truth hung in the air. We had both found something neither of us had been looking for. When we reached the parking lot where Helen's car was parked, she hesitated. What now? She asked, looking at me with uncertainty. I had been thinking about that very question. What was next? She let out a deep breath. I don't want to share a bed with Alex ever again. I want to be with you. Hearing those words felt like a balm on my wounded heart. I reached for her hand, holding it firmly. The four of us are really getting divorced, I said. And as soon as the papers are finalized, I want to marry you the very next day. Her eyes widened in surprise. I know it might seem too soon, I admitted. But the truth is we've known each other for years. It's only been a few days since we even considered this possibility, but I don't need more time to know what I want. I looked at her, my heart pounding, waiting for her response. I reached for Helen's hands, my voice steady and sincere. Helen, my feelings for you are real. I am completely dedicated to loving you. Please take your time and think about it. She nodded but said nothing, her expression unreadable. When you leave for my office, drive carefully, I added. Then, without thinking, I leaned in and kissed her gently. The moment was short-lived. What happened next would shake me to my core. When we arrived at my house, I wasn't prepared for what we found. They were there, Mary and Alex, completely lost in their own world, too engrossed in their betrayal to even acknowledge our presence. My stomach churned. They hadn't just disrespected our marriages. They had defiled our home. Ignoring the sickening display before me, I turned to Helen. Come sit, I said, motioning toward the sofa. She hesitated but eventually sat down beside me. She refused to look me in the eye. I understood why. Seeing them like this, so unapologetically tangled up in each other, was beyond painful. The room was filled with an awkward mess of sounds, movements, and words that made the entire scene even more revolting. Then finally they stopped. That's when Alex turned and saw us. His face drained of color. Oh no, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary, mid-motion, froze completely. Helen was the first to break the silence. You ruined my carpet. Mary scrambled to justify the situation. It wasn't. Just a physical attraction? Helen cut in sharply. A heavy silence filled the room. Alex, still avoiding eye contact, finally muttered, "I think I love her." I turned to Mary. "And you? Do you love Alex?" She reacted immediately, her expression unreadable. But then, instead of answering my question, she turned to Alex and asked, "If things were different, would you consider moving in together?" Alex hesitated. He glanced at Mary before looking down. "I don't want my marriage to be over." I felt a bitter laugh bubble up inside me. "So what are you asking for?" "My permission to keep seeing my wife." Neither of them answered. I turned to Alex, my voice sharp. "Do you really expect Helen to suffer through this alone while you sit here, trying to figure out what you want?" The room fell silent again, thick with unspoken words. I had heard enough. Helen, however, wasn't done. She turned to Mary, her expression cold. "You have 5 minutes to pack your things and leave." Mary's mouth opened as if to argue, but Helen wasn't interested in a debate. Alex stood motionless as Helen looked at her watch. "If either of you tries to come back without speaking to a lawyer first, I will make sure everyone sees the evidence. Your children included." The threat hung heavy in the air. Mary's lips trembled, but she said nothing. As if this wasn't already twisted enough, she turned to me one last time and whispered, "I never wanted to hurt you. It's just that with Alex." I felt important. I exhaled, my anger giving way to something worse, disgust. I wasn't going to waste another second trying to understand her reasoning. This wasn't my failure. This was her choice. Mary's voice wavered as she spoke, her words filled with defeat. "I believe you can handle everything without me. The children don't really need me anymore. You've got everything under control." She paused, looking down before continuing. "Alex made me feel important." I let out a bitter chuckle. "He didn't even say goodbye when he left, did he?" Mary flinched. "He's not filing for divorce, Mary," I added, my voice calm but firm. "That means he doesn't want to be with you. He's not choosing you. You were just convenient for him. Do you understand what role you played in this situation?" She met my gaze, searching for some kind of reassurance, some kind of lie that would make this easier to accept. But I wasn't going to give it to her. I saw the realization dawn in her eyes, the truth she had been trying so hard to ignore. She wasn't special to Alex. She was just a temporary distraction. "I used to be a good wife," she murmured, her voice filled with regret. She looked lost, like she was waking up from a dream only to find herself in a nightmare of her own making. Now I'm nobody." Her sadness quickly turned to anger as she turned on Alex. "What have you done to me?" she demanded, her voice sharp with pain. "What are you going to do now? You don't even care what happens to us, do you? We got caught and now you're just leaving me." Alex barely reacted. He simply stood there, silent, indifferent. Mary's fury escalated. "You jerk," she spat. "If I could, I'd send those photos to your children, not just mine." I wasn't going to stand there and watch her unravel. I turned to Helen. "If Alex shows up before I get back, call me on my cell." Alex, the man who had so callously used my wife for his own selfish desires, was even more pathetic than I had imagined. He had betrayed me without hesitation and now had the audacity to abandon Mary without a second thought. I had once cursed him in my mind for what he had done, but now I realized he wasn't even worth my anger. As I got into my car, I spoke softly to Helen. "Hang on, I'll be there soon. I love you." The call ended, leaving me with a heavy heart. As I pulled into the driveway, I spotted Alex's car parked out front. A surge of irritation ran through me, but before I could do anything, flashing red and blue lights filled the street. The police had arrived. They moved quickly, cuffing Alex as he shouted incoherent threats. "You'll regret this. I'll find you," he bellowed as they shoved him into the back seat of the patrol car. Helen arrived just in time, and we exchanged a glance before speaking briefly with the officers. The shouting continued from inside the police car, but neither of us paid it much attention. He wasn't a threat anymore, just a desperate man who had lost everything. Once the police drove away, we walked back into the building. Helen turned to me, a questioning look in her eyes. "Did you really send those photos?" I shook my head. "No. It would only hurt Alex's children." I exhaled, running a hand down my face. "They're coming next weekend for their mother's birthday. If they ask about the photos, then maybe, but right now they don't need to know." Helen nodded in agreement. "Some truths are better left untold, at least until the right moment comes." "I won't show them the photos," I said quietly. "And I hope they never ask to see them." Helen nodded in agreement. Some things were better left buried. Seeing how shaken Alex had been after his arrest, I decided to contact the police again. I detailed everything that had happened, emphasizing my concerns about his violent tendencies. I had seen firsthand what he was capable of, and I wasn't going to take any risks. I was afraid he would hurt you, I admitted to Helen. And in a way he did. Maybe not in the way we expected, but the pain he caused you, it was real. She gave me a small, tired smile. Maybe you could kiss me to ease the pain, she teased lightly. I smirked. That actually sounds like a good plan. Maybe we should go to the bedroom, she added softly, her eyes searching mine. Calm down a bit. I pulled her into an embrace and she melted into it. As we walked toward the bedroom, I braced myself for the emotions that would inevitably come, but when we stepped inside, I was surprised to find the room completely empty. Before I could say anything, my phone rang. I answered, my voice tense. You didn't tell me over the phone, the voice on the other end said. No, I replied. I'm sorry to keep you waiting, but it's better this way. After I ended the call, I turned back to Helen, only to find her standing near the bed, pale and motionless. She was on the phone, but as soon as she saw me, she motioned for me to come closer. She covered the mouthpiece and whispered, It's Carol. Her father called her from prison last night. He's asking for bail. Helen's expression darkened. She wants to know what happened. I sighed. Find out when they can return. We need to figure this out together. Before long, my phone rang again. I glanced at the screen and handed it to Helen. It's Carol, I told her. Helen answered, speaking quietly. After a few minutes, she hung up. She'll be here in an hour, she said. Not long after, my own children called. We're on our way, my son said. We'll be there in about an hour. Helen and I exchanged glances. The house was about to be full. She gave me a small smile. I'll order some pizza and salad for delivery. I nodded, grateful for the distraction. Meanwhile, I found myself pacing the bedroom, restless, feeling like I needed to do something. I started gathering clothes and straightening up, anything to occupy my hands. After a while, I stepped out of the bedroom and found Helen standing by the window, lost in thought. I walked over and wrapped my arms around her, resting my chin on her shoulder. When the food arrived, everyone was gathered in the kitchen. Before anyone could start eating, I lifted my hand to silence them. The food can wait, I said. Let's all gather in the living room. I need to explain everything. Helen's children sat on one sofa while mine took the other. I motioned for Helen to sit in the large armchair, and I grabbed a chair from the kitchen, taking a deep breath. It was time to tell the truth. Just as I was about to sit down, a knock at the door interrupted me. I opened it to find my lawyer, Henry Hawkins, standing there with a large envelope in his hands. He glanced toward the living room, noticing all the children gathered inside. Lowering his voice, he wished me luck and asked if I needed him to stay. I shook my head. No, but I appreciate it. Thank you, Henry. He gave a nod and quietly left. I carried the envelope inside, feeling its weight in my hands. Before I could open it, Helen spoke up. My lawyer suggested that we take a few days away from the city, she said, looking around the room. Just to clear our heads and figure out the next steps. So what did you do? Carol asked, her curiosity evident. Helen went to the Mirage in Las Vegas, I explained. And I stayed at Treasure Island. Carol's eyes flickered to the envelope resting on the floor. Are those the photos of Alex and Mary? She asked, gesturing toward it. I nodded. Yeah. The room fell silent for a moment before Helen sighed. Nick and I decided to postpone our return for an extra day. The whole situation was just disgusting. When we finally did return home, the reality of everything hit us all over again. Alex and Mary had been staying at Helen's house, just like they had been using my home before. Wow, Carol muttered, shaking her head in disbelief. The others nodded in agreement, the weight of the situation finally settling in. So, what happens now? One of them asked. Helen exhaled, folding her hands in her lap. There will be changes, she said simply. I've decided to sell the house, I added. It's too big for me right now. Helen's daughter immediately spoke up, her voice filled with concern. Mom, I don't want to move. Helen reached over and squeezed her hand. I understand, she said gently. But I'm thinking about getting a roommate instead. We'll figure it out. The conversation shifted for a while, but then Carol hesitated before asking, Mom, are you and Nick together? Helen paused, considering her words. We spent a lot of time in Las Vegas, she admitted. But when we came home. She didn't need to finish her sentence. Everyone in the room understood. The envelope still sat unopened on the table. Taking a deep breath, I finally reached inside and pulled out about 10 photos. I didn't react as I examined each one, flipping through the images calmly before sliding them back into the envelope. There was nothing surprising about them. Just confirmation of what I already knew. After that, we moved on. We finished the last of the pizza and salad, then later that evening, we went out for dinner at a Chinese restaurant. Despite everything, the betrayals, the heartbreak, the changes, there was something comforting about sitting together as a group. The children, our lifelong friends, had slowly begun to accept the reality of this new, blended family. As we waited for our fortune cookies, my son Matt looked up. "Maybe we should plan a hike this summer," he suggested. Helen smiled warmly. "That sounds like a great idea." For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. Not everything was perfect, but there was still happiness to be found in the life ahead. As I sat there, I wondered if Alex ever thought about it, the fact that he had the opportunity to keep his house, his job, and Helen, and yet he threw it all away.